Canadians hold vigils to mark all prisoners' deaths. Many prisoners fast or on that day, while others outside of prison meet and call for a more humane correctional system. Since Mr. Nellon's death 41 years ago, we've become increasingly aware of the link between solitary confinement, deteriorating mental health, and suicides in prisons. Just this year, 2 women tragically lost their lives in the Nova Scotia facility in Truro. Mr. Speaker, far too often our prisons serve as a residence for the poor, addicted and mentally ill. To mark the 40th anniversary of Prisoners' Justice Day, I urge the Minister of Justice to ensure all facilities in Nova Scotia environments are environments where rehabilitation comes first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time allotted for member statements has expired, and we'll now move on to orders of the day with oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Yesterday, we learned of the desperate efforts of a Bedford family to get their 13-year-old son the help he needed at the IWK while dealing with a mental illness. We know he was turned away repeatedly until he made an attempt on his own life. Mr. Speaker, fortunately, he was eventually, after that, referred to the IWK Adolescent Intensive Services Treatment Program. But, Mr. Speaker, the boy refused to go. And under the law, Mr. Speaker, his parents can't do anything about that. I'd just like to ask the Premier, does he think it's appropriate that when a 13-year-old boy struggling with mental illness refuses the help he needs, that his parents are helpless to get him the help that he needs?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me say to the honourable member opposite, I think every member of this House would be recognizes the challenges that some families face, Mr. Speaker, and some of the circumstances around adolescent mental health. If you see the changes that are making in the system over the last number of years, Mr. Speaker, is responding to the challenges that show up. Sometimes they show up because of individual cases. Other times you see them you almost show up at every case, and you respond to those and try to make the changes to make supports more accessible for families, Mr. Speaker, and for those who require those services. I had the good fortune recently of being at the Garron Centre. The changes that have taken place there, it's remarkable to me compared to what was there before, and we'll continue to work with community and with families to make sure that the system is there to be able to respond to individual circumstances.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The problem in this case is the Involuntary Psychiatric Treatment Act, which requires patients' consent to be treated regardless of their age. Even a 13-year-old boy can refuse treatment, Mr. Speaker, even if his parents want him to get that treatment desperately. As Steve, the boy's father, said, and I quote, "If you have a mentally challenged individual who is 13 years old, who cannot make rational decisions, the legal guardian should be able to have the authority to help him get the help that he needs." Well, we agree with that, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Premier if he agrees with that, and if so, will he review the Involuntary Psychiatric Treatment Act and see to it that changes are made to allow parents to get their kids the help that they need?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for the question. As I said at the beginning in the first question, Mr. Speaker, we're always looking at public policy and how we can improve it so that it responds to the needs of individual families. I know the department will be looking at this particular circumstance and what's been highlighted based not just this case, if it's showing up in other places, and if there needs to be changed to public policy. The government, Mr. Speaker, of any political stripe would try to respond to the needs of its citizens.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that is all well and good in a general sense, but here is a very specific action that the government can take that doesn't cost any money, that could actually see young children like this young boy get the help that they need when their parents want them to have it. So I encourage the Premier to take a look at that act and make those changes. But, of course, the problem is more than just this one story, Mr. Speaker, and as Steve, the father himself, said, we are a family in crisis. There is a problem in the system. It has to be rectified, and I have no option except to speak out, and I commend Steve, the father in this case, for speaking out. So I'll ask the Premier if he'll listen to the voices of Steve and all the other parents out there who need help and call a public inquiry into the state of mental health services in the province.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. I too want to applaud the family for speaking out. It's very challenging times. It's painful, Mr. Speaker, when families have loved ones that they're trying to respond to, and then having to have that displayed in front of all of us, Mr. Speaker. Challenging but courageous at the same time on behalf of those families. And as I said to the honourable member in my first two questions, the minister, our partners across this province will continue to work, continue to look at public policy in a way. Is it working? Is it responding to what's happening in families and in communities across this province? If not, we'll make the adjustments.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General tabled a report today, and Chapter 4 of that report focuses on funding to universities. The report highlights that universities are on track to run a structural deficit of $50 million by 2018-19, something we've heard the minister say in the past. And this government is attempting, Mr. Speaker, to deal with that deficit by allowing tuition to rise. Meanwhile, university executives are continuing to earn more and more. So my question for the Premier is this: why is the government allowing university executives to collect increasingly excessive salaries while students are being asked to pay more and more than ever before?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable members for welcoming me. I want to tell you that the premise of the question is absolutely inaccurate and wrong. If you go back, Mr. Speaker, before this House was Bill 100, it actually brought in accountability and sustainability of post-secondary education, which I want to remind the honourable member she voted against. It's for these very things. Reading accountability. When they were in government, they allowed universities to continue to do as they wish. We want to know how they're spending the money. This accountability piece will provide the proper reporting mechanism. We can look at it, make sure it's being spent in the right way for students, Mr. Speaker, and ensure that we continue to have the high-quality post-secondary education that we have affordable in this province as we go forward.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, reporting that administrators are making these excessive salaries does little to do anything to contain those salaries, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just a few days ago, we learned that the former president of St. Yves was able to collect $1.2 million for administrative leave that he was not able to take during his term as president. Combine this, Mr. Speaker, with the structural deficit facing universities, and it's evident there's a problem. However, the government's plan to address the system involves lifting the tuition cap, restricting collective bargaining of unionized employees, and no mention of escalating university executive salaries. So my question to the Premier is simple. Will the Premier commit to capping the salaries of university administrators?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I also want to remind the honourable member it was her party that was in power when that contract was signed that you're referring to, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government will do what it do at universities levels the same way it's done to P-12 education. We will always put students first.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, our government put a cap on tuition for students, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we know that universities in Nova Scotia are depending more and more on students from outside the province to maintain enrollment numbers. In fact, over a third of students at our universities come from other provinces. However, the removal of the tuition cap for an indefinite amount of time on out-of-province students could put enrollment numbers on risk. So my question for the Premier is what is being done to ensure the lifting of the tuition cap does not force an overall decline in enrollment, which will further increase the likelihood of an ongoing structural deficit at the universities?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I also want to thank those thousands of students, from tens of thousands of students, Mr. Speaker, from across Canada and really across the world, who recognize, Mr. Speaker, who recognize the high quality of post-secondary education that is offered in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, at every institution that we have. I also want to remind the honourable member those institutions rely on those foreign students and other sons and daughters of Canadian citizens to come to this province They know full well, Mr. Speaker, they have to be competitive in this global marketplace in order to continue to attract those bright young people who, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, we've just added some great public policy that will allow them to remain here in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians need to know they can rely on crucial government programs and services, even in the case of an emergency. But we learned from the Auditor General's report today that the Premier has assigned no one in government to take responsibility for business continuity planning, in other words, making sure that critical services in corrections, housing, or emergency management is officially assigned responsibility for this very important task. Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Premier why no one in his government was assigned to ensure that services are available to Nova Scotians on a constant basis.
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to assure him, Mr. Speaker, that we had identified this issue before, and it falls under the responsibility of Minister Koutsoulis.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, in fact, Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General reported that although the Department of Internal Services has taken on informal responsibility for this process, that no one actually has been given the authority to make sure that government services, important and critical ones, are available despite emergencies that we may face, Mr. Speaker. And although the Department informally has taken on that responsibility and done things like developing templates for use by others, it turns out that departments aren't required to use them. And in fact, some departments on their own are spending time and money developing alternatives to the ones that were informally provided by the Department of Internal Services. It's ultimately the Premier's office that's responsible for these cross-department initiatives. I'd like to ask him, why is he taking such a haphazard approach to something as important as emergency planning across government?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Auditor General for the work that he does. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Minister Koutsoulis for the work that he's doing on behalf of all government. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I've obviously got some attention over there, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, it would be helpful, Mr. Speaker. It would be helpful, Mr. Speaker, for democracy if the Leader of the Conservative Party could at least ask a simple question that he would need to require that would somehow move the debate along.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Advanced Education. Mr. Speaker, back in December 22nd, 2011, when the Minister was in opposition, she is quoted as saying that she didn't know if economists would think that raising a tuition would be anything other than a disaster, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, last night, a meeting was held at NASCAD outlining a 37% tuition increase, which would make NASCAD the most expensive fine arts school in the country. So my question for the Minister is this. What is she prepared to do to prevent a 37% increase in tuition at NASCAD, which in her own words a few years ago would be nothing short of a recipe for disaster?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for the question. It is interesting how much we learn when we're in government, isn't it? I would like to point out for the honourable member's information that students at NASCAD have, in fact, in the past been able to take free courses. So they would pay for 4 courses, and they could take a 5th and 6th free of charge. We think it reasonable that our universities be able to charge similar amounts for similar courses. We certainly understand and sympathize with students that any change in tuition can be difficult, and Mr. Speaker, that is why we have one of the best student assistance programs in the country.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have one of the best student assistance programs in the country because we made it so when we were in government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker,
it hurts so bad, doesn't it?
Mr. Speaker, back in 2011, before the Minister knew what she knows now, Mr. Speaker, She called tuition increases a recipe for disaster. Today she calls a 37% increase reasonable, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're watching tuition rise all across this province, and students will be hurt by this, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the minister is, while cost after cost is piling up on the backs of Nova Scotian students, what is she prepared to do for the student population so they don't have to wear this exorbitant debt load, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As I indicated earlier, we do understand that any increase in tuition can be difficult for students and their families, and that's why we have one of the best student assistance programs in the country. We have a $1,300 bursary that goes to every undergraduate student who's studying here in Nova Scotia. We have loan forgiveness. We have 0% interest. What's interesting is that suddenly the NDP is concerned about students. When they were in government, they slashed $35 million from universities. And now they're shocked. Mr. Speaker, now they're shocked. Oh my goodness, they can't believe that universities can't balance their budgets. That's why they can't.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Earlier this year, the minister uncapped tuition rates. And we do already see tuition increases happening all across the province. And reasonable or not, I guess, is not the question for today. The question for today is, just this morning, the Auditor General's report found that the department is not holding universities accountable for the funding provided. So we have uncapped tuition rates, more money for the universities from the students, but yet the department is not holding the universities accountable. So my question today is, why is this government asking students and their families to pay more when they don't even know if the financial performance of the universities is effective or efficient?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question. I would point out, Mr. Speaker, that we do know what the financial position is of the universities. Unfortunately, there was not regular accounting in the past, and that's one of the things that concerned me when I came in and I was minister. So as a result of that, we brought in the University Accountability and Sustainability Act, which will give us students and taxpayers a better idea of what's going on at universities, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure right now that particular member is sitting there and wishing that he had voted for that particular act.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, a little history lesson might be effective here. The tuition rates were uncapped, and then this bill came in. And we'll see how this bill performs. But the reality is, this government, the first move they moved was to turn to the pockets of students and ask them and their families to pay more. They were willing to do that instead of hold universities accountable. We've already seen the graduate retention rebate taken away, uncapped tuitions. Where does it end? So the question today is for the minister, does this government plan to also address the $50 million potential deficit that we've heard talked about today? The Auditor General expressed his concerns about it. Does this government intend to turn to students and their families to pay that $50 million potential deficit as well? Is that their first move on that one?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for his question. He is in error. Tuitions are not uncapped. That seems to be a myth that he likes to keep repeating. It's not true. They are not uncapped. Actually, read the information, you'll understand that, number one. Number two, Mr. Speaker, the University Accountability and Sustainability Act gives us a better idea of when a university is getting in trouble. There is no doubt, and I was very clear about this in February. Our universities are heading into an unsustainable position, and if he has any suggestions, I'm happy to hear them. But I'll tell you right now, Mr. Speaker, they should have voted for the University Sustainability and Accountability Act, because that will give us a better picture when they're getting into position.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, this morning's Auditor General's report contained many things to make parents of school-aged children concerned. The Auditor General found that the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development is not providing adequate oversight and monitoring of educational services delivered by school boards. The Department has not established educational performance standards of performance targets for provincial assessments, and that there is no clear defined accountability relationship between the school boards and the Department. My question, Mr. Speaker, parents expect the Minister of Education to provide oversight of the education their children receive. Why has this accountability been ignored?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member for the question. And I would like to remind everyone in the House that the audit that's just been completed and reported on by the Auditor General is one that I called for as the Minister to ensure that we were clear. To ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we were clear on roles and responsibilities, that elected board members were clear on their roles and responsibilities, and I will maintain, Mr. Speaker, that the effectiveness of education in our classrooms depends on the relationship between the classroom teacher and the students there.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Department of Education is ultimately responsible for the education results of all students in the province, but it is not actively monitoring or acting on these results. Parents want and deserve to know how their children are doing in relationship to other children across the province. My question, Mr. Speaker, how can parents be sure their children are getting the education they need to succeed and compete if the department does not actively monitor or act on education results?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite and to others who are listening. It's important to know that one of the priorities that we set when we formed government was education. And the second thing that we did was we listened to what teachers and parents told us when we did our ministers' panel. And one of the things that they made very clear to us was the importance of understanding what their students were asked to learn and what the results of those assessments were. And that takes place on a regular basis, daily assessments by teachers and system-wide assessments and also the provincial assessments. That information is based on the program and curriculum, and it is shared with parents, and they certainly appreciate that.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Health. Yesterday, we asked the Premier about the Nova Scotia Health Authority's deficit and planned cuts to deal with this deficit. The Premier didn't know what was going on, Mr. Speaker, but I would hope that the Department of Health is in constant contact with the new health authority. So I'd like to ask the Minister. I do mean it, Mr. Speaker. How far into deficit has the new health board fallen?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for the question. And one of the very early initiatives was to have a very, very strong communication process between the Department of Health and the Nova Scotia Health Authority. And I know that when the Health Authority came into existence, it obviously had to pick up the deficits that were there from the previous 9 districts. Which were, in fact, there year after year after year, and under the previous government, bailed out by the Department of Health and Wellness. That will not happen under this government.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
I don't think the Minister heard me. I asked him about this year's budget, Mr. Speaker. We know from that answer Nova Scotia should be concerned. There are going to be widespread cuts across health care, Mr. Speaker, because he is not living up to the responsibility of being the Minister of Health, Mr. Speaker. In the Nova Scotia Health Authority's meeting minutes from June, people need to be quiet to listen to the question, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Financial Officer stated that he had been meeting with staff across... No, you keep your hat, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Financial Officer has been meeting with staff across the province to deliver the message, which I assume came from the Minister of Health, that the board is serious about meeting their targets to reduce the deficit. So I'd like to ask the Minister again, what targets have the Department of Health given to the Health Authority, and what reductions are we going to see in the future?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I'm pleased about today is the strong direction that Board Chair Stephen Parker is giving to the Health Authority, monitoring what is taking place in terms of their directives right across the province. We know that there is tremendous duplication, redundancy in the system. That's what the directive is talking about. I anticipate that we will see a balanced budget come the end of 15-16.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister responsible for public service. The Minister stood today and referred to an announcement that he made last week, and indeed gave a bit more detail today on how that would work. But I would ask the Minister, of those 70 jobs for our youth and new graduates that he's referring to, is there a policy or a process in place along with that that speaks to how they will be divvied up throughout the province?
The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for the question. The positions are province from one end of the province to the other. And I would also like to add that when I scanned the positions last week, there were approximately 5 or 6 that were in the members' general area of Wolfville and the Valley. And Mr. Speaker, while I have this opportunity, anyone at home, if they'd like to see where these positions are listed, the 70 positions with very little to no work experience are at makeithere.novascotia.ca, and all positions in the public service are posted on careerbeacon.ca. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister, although a little geography lesson maybe later about where Wolfville and my constituency are. But that said, not that far away, Mr. Speaker, not that far away. Can the Minister, a few kilometres, can the Minister clarify how many of those public service jobs actually exist throughout the valley, maybe including Windsor as part of that valley and down through at least the eastern part of that, and potentially how many could end up in that area, or if there is a specific number?
The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have the exact number, but I can ask the department to pull together how many of our public service positions are in those areas and provide them to the member. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. Today we heard about a foster parent in Cape Breton who struggled with the department's decision not to allow her to adopt one of her foster children. After posting her experience on social media, she received a call from the Department of Community Services in which she felt the finalizing of another adoption was being threatened. The question is there a policy that would result in the future adoption of another foster child because of that situation? Would that put in jeopardy the adoption of another foster child?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you for the question. When I travel the province and I meet with various foster parents, and I've said and I've been on record, in my opinion, foster parents are the greatest human resource that the province of Nova Scotia has. Foster parents go through a very strenuous assessment phase. They must adhere to all kinds of policies and procedures that go around the care of children, and they all provide a safe and stable environment for children in care. I won't speak to specifics of any case, but the policies and the processes for adoption and permanent care are there in place, and they are available to every foster parent that is in the system right now.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you. I rest my case.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, today the Auditor General revealed that not all schools are conducting emergency drills as required. and this is a concern. The safety of our schools and school staff should be a top priority, but today we learned that some schools are falling short. My question, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister commit today to meeting with the appropriate school board members and school principals of the 6 schools who failed to comply?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member. And I would agree, I think everyone in this House would agree, that the safety of our students and staff in our buildings is a #1 priority every day of every month of every year. So to recognize the National Fire Code standards is something that we automatically do. And we expect principals in the schools to adhere to those standards and to conduct the fire drills and the evacuation drills as per those standards. When it was brought to our attention that some had not, we immediately met with the superintendents. That has already happened, and I can assure you that that will be monitored more closely, not only by the principal and the superintendent, but by the department.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the firefighters that we have spoken to are very concerned. It's very important that students and staff know how to get out of their school in an emergency. And I worry this may just be the tip of the iceberg. We certainly do not want to witness a tragedy in the province. My question to the Minister, will the Minister commit to a full review of the 2014-15 fire drill record in every school in Nova Scotia and make those findings public so parents can see how their schools measure up?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member. I think it's important, and most of us here would recognize, and I'm sure the member would, as his previous life as a school teacher and principal, is that the relationship that exists between the local fire departments and the school is strong, it is important, and the students in those schools in the schools recognize, understand, and appreciate the role of the firefighters in the community. So when they come into the schools to do education programs, they have a captive audience, and we will continue to work with the fire departments and with the parents and with the students to make sure, as I said, that every student and every staff member is safe all of the time when they're in those buildings.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, in October 2015, the Mental Health Strategy Progress Update, one objective seems to have disappeared from the Minister's radar, and that is collect and monitor alcohol, drug, and gaming data. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is odd because in the Mental Health Strategy Update in 2013, collecting gambling data was shown to be implemented, Mr. Speaker, but now in the Minister's Progress Update, this objective is blank, and I'll table those, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Minister can explain why in his update it does not include collecting gambling data, which was included in previous updates.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the former Health Minister for that important question. The data has been collected. The report is still being put together. One of the areas, of course, that we all know from previous reports is that there needs to be that whole validity check on certain sample sizes. So that is currently being put together, and I am pretty certain it could be before Christmas, but January at the latest when that full report will be released to the public.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, and I thank the Minister for his question. The Minister will know that the Auditor General in his June report found that the Department does not monitor gambling treatment and does not know whether prevention and treatment services result in reducing gambling-related harms. And without the collection and monitoring of gambling data, it's hard to be able to know if you have the right prevention and treatment services in place. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Minister, when will he be making this information available so that we can get on with developing the important treatment programs that are needed for people with gambling addictions? The
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for that important question, providing Nova Scotians with information on what the trends are. The data has been collected. It will obviously be released, but more importantly, at the same time, we will take the monies that were in the foundation when it was collapsed, and we'll be identifying a number of research and support programs that money can be used for. In the past, it had a very, very restrictive clause around how that money can be used. We need to loosen that up so that these monies can get out in support of Nova Scotians who need treatment and who need long-term support.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. Mr. Speaker, in the months since the government's ill-conceived action of the film tax credit, we have learned that many of the dire warnings advanced by the industry have come true. Production has fallen under the new system, and skilled and vibrant workers and taxpayers are leaving for work elsewhere. Money is being left on the table and is becoming increasingly difficult to attract investment in Nova Scotia because of an incentive fund that is unworkable. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister is this. How many film workers is the Minister prepared to lose to other provinces before developing a workable incentive structure that will bring investment, economic activity and jobs back in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for the question. I'm not sure where my colleague has been for the last number of months, but there has been significant attention not only to the film industry, but to the success of the film industry. We've had a number of discussions, Mr. Speaker, with the film industry, and we know we have the same objective. Certainly. We've listened, Mr. Speaker, to what the industry has said to us, and the most important message that we received from them is it was absolutely necessary to change the discussion around the film industry itself and its viability in the province of Nova Scotia. We've worked with the industry. We've attempted in working with them to restore the confidence of the industry so that our domestic and international partners will see the same.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Kings North.
I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer, Mr. Speaker, but I wonder if we are talking about the same industry. We've heard that, in fact, the production numbers have dropped off, and the new fund has not been fully subscribed, is fairly significantly undersubscribed. The policy, what we're hearing from the industry, is that this policy is not working. Does the Minister consider a policy, this is my question, Mr. Speaker, does the Minister consider a policy change that has forced many tax-paying Nova Scotians to move away for work or to find themselves on social assistance a meaningful solution to Nova Scotia's economic problems?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The industry has told us clearly that the new Film Television Production Incentive Fund is working. Mr. Speaker, I want to reference, Mr. Speaker, and I'll table these articles from the media on July the 19th, where a prominent international producer has encouraging words about Nova Scotia's future as a film production centre. And he went on to say, my feeling is the new incentive scheme is very workable and can go a long way towards helping keep film and television shows coming to Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the chair of the Screen Nova Scotia indicated that we're not looking to have the fund returned, we're trying to move forward. And he went on to say, Mr. Speaker, we need to address the lack of business confidence. I think that we can do this in partnership with government, but it's required that both parties work together. Mr. Speaker, this government has done that. Last week we announced significant program funding for the film industry, and they're very supportive of those efforts.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister responsible for tourism. With annual revenues of over $2 billion and plans to double that figure, the tourism industry truly is an economic generator for our province. With an Ontario company now at the helm of a $6 million annual marketing budget, can the Minister please explain how the government will gauge annually the outcomes of DDBS marketing strategy for Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. The marketing service contract that has been recently awarded is a direct result of recommendations out of the Ivany report to change the way we do business. And for us in the department, Mr. Speaker, we have an objective to double tourism revenues up to 2024. We believe, through a very fair, transparent process, we have the best in class to support Tourism Nova Scotia's efforts in that regard.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, Deans markets 4 counties, 12 municipalities. They have an amazing track record of marketing these areas. However, with having $60,000 of core funding cut from their budget, marketing will now be limited. Will the minister support Deans in implementing a marketing levy, much like other jurisdictions in Nova Scotia, to help Deans continue their marketing efforts? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. Tourism Nova Scotia will continue to work with our regional partners in identifying new opportunities and options to advance the tourism industry. But I want to repeat what I said earlier. We have an ambitious goal to double tourism revenues in the province by 2024. And the focus, Mr. Speaker, is on attracting new first-time visitors and aligning resources against marketing activities to increase visitations to the province. That's the objective of the tourism strategy, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to work with our local partners to achieve those objectives.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question, Mr. Speaker, is to the Minister of Health. On June 4th, the Minister told the Chronicle Herald, and I will quote, "We will, by August, have a very definitive statement on how the Collaborative Emergency Centre will proceed for Lunenburg," and I will table that, Mr. Speaker. My question, what was that very definitive statement by the Minister of Health in August on the Lunenburg Collaborative Emergency Centre?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, that statement was that the Provincial Health Authority were carrying out their clinical services review, and what services and how they will be delivered in the future is what will be is being addressed. And for all of our CECs that are in existence and those that will be developed, they all have different requirements, and we've now tasked the Provincial Health Authority to provide communities with that plan, and that is their mandate.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but that wasn't the answer, because the question at that time was directly about the Lunenburg Emergency Centre being collaborative. So I hope that I get more of a specific answer this time. I'm pleased that the CECs are on the way, but I'm disappointed that the Liberal government have taken so long to get the process on the go in Lunenburg. And the ER was even closed last evening. Not having made any tangible progress in 2 years is just unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, when will the Lunenburg Collaborative Emergency Centre open? And I have another document to table.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And we all know that as these centres develop, it depends on the clinical teams as to how and what level of support they will give a collaborative practice. It's not just a matter, as the Health Authority is discovering, of going in and establish it and setting it up. It has to be done in concert with the medical community, with the doctors, the nurses, and those support teams in order to make it work. And that's the work that's currently going on with the Health Authority.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. In April, I joined him to announce the long-awaited start of construction at the Dartmouth General Hospital, and I applaud him for being part of pushing that important project forward. As part of the tour, sincerely I do. As part of the tour after, the Minister and Health Authority representatives spoke to the media about the Dartmouth General becoming a centre of excellence for orthopaedics in the province, something they said would alleviate the pressure in Halifax and would locate a significant percentage of the orthopaedic work in the new operating facilities in Dartmouth. Is this still the Minister's intention?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I'm certainly pleased with the work and the plan that's going on at Dartmouth General, with the 3rd and 4th floor well under revision. We'll be starting on the 5th floor, a surgical theatre, as soon as that final design is in. It will be really up to the Health Authority to say what centre of excellence. We all know the tremendous orthopedic need. We also know that Dartmouth General is fortunate to have an outstanding orthopedic team, and that certainly could be one of those considerations that the Health Authority will give strong support to.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it sounds a bit like it's what was a certainty is now a maybe. On the day of the announcement, and I'll table 2 news articles from the day, one from Metro News which says the Dartmouth General hopes to continue its success in orthopedics and become a centre for excellence in the area that medical professionals across the country would look to. And in Global News from the same day, I will quote, "What is planned for about 50 beds on the 5th floor is now absolutely needed," said the Minister, and part of a provincial plan that will fit very well in looking over the next 10 to 20 years. Once the renovations are complete, there are big plans for it. The hospital will become a specialized centre. The hospital would become an orthopedic centre. Mr. Speaker, I will table those articles. I'm just wondering, why are we backing off that now?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And you know, before we had the provincial health authority, it was certainly much easier for government to say this is exactly what will be done. We know that we're now looking at all services from a provincial perspective. The health authority has done the clinical services review. They know very well the tremendous need for orthopedic work. We have a long wait list, and I think we'll have to wait for the Provincial Health Authority to make a final determination, but certainly the need is very strong.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question is also to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, in February 2015, the steps at the front doors of the Northside General Hospital were closed, secondary to crumbling infrastructure. The people of Northside were told that these steps would be fixed and the front doors would be open when the weather broke. Mr. Speaker, we're almost into another weather season and there's no construction yet. Can the Minister assure the people of Northside that their steps will be fixed this year?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it may sound some days like a little bit of a push-off to the Health Authority, but indeed operations, and that's why we see every day a strengthening of services and standards across the province. And what I'll tell the honourable member, since it is indeed one of those urgent and safety areas, and before the day is out, I will be speaking to the Health Authority to move this project forward.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. There was also supposed to be a plan in place for the ER and the lab at the Northside General. But now it's mid-November and we don't have any plan yet. Can the Minister update the concerned citizens on the Northside what the plans are for the emergency room and the lab at the Northside General?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know that we've had teams at Northside, working with the medical community there, doctors, nurses, and others, to make sure that there is an adequate service that will be provided. getting collaborative practices going so that primary care is looked after. Primary care is essential to reduce the burden and the demands on an emergency room. The people of, in fact, of North Sydney and Greater Cape Breton are fortunate to have an outstanding ER at Cape Breton General.
The honourable member for Queens, Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal. Yesterday in question period, the Minister indicated that he had yet to receive a complaint concerning non-payment by Novastar to Nova Scotian suppliers. In today's Chronicle Herald article, which I'll table, we learned that Novastar owes over $200,000 to various Nova Scotia companies. So my question, Mr. Speaker, through you, the Minister has stated that the department reviews Novastar's expenses. Can the Minister table a list of Nova Scotia vendors who are owed this money?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
No, Mr. Speaker, I can't. We don't have that list. As I said yesterday, what I said is absolutely accurate. What we looked at with respect to the cash flows for the Novastar entity was about the general line items that spoke to the health of their service and their ability to continue under the confines and the constraints of the $13 million deal we had on the table. I don't have that list, Mr. Speaker. I haven't been approached, Mr. Speaker. Everything that I said yesterday is true and accurate. And again, we're going to get this right and work together with Bay Ferries for 2016. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Queens, Shelburne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I encourage the member to get the list. In fact, if he doesn't pay the piper.
Oh. I was right into it, so sorry. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers have expired. We'll now move on to opposition business. The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
I don't know. It was getting good there for a minute. Can you call private members' bills 119, Mental Health Inquiry Act?
We'll now call Bill number 119, the Mental Health Inquiry Act. The Honourable Leader of the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am so very pleased to rise today and speak to this bill. It's a very important bill. It is actually a bill that can provide real help to real Nova Scotians who every day are suffering because they have a family member who is mentally ill, or they are mentally ill, or